All right, everybody. Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Leland Lazarus, and I have the privilege of serving as president and chair of the Fulbright Association. And so, on behalf of all of us, thank you for joining us for today's discussion, which is part of our ongoing Fulbright Lens speaker series. This is a program that's designed to bring leading experts to our global Fulbright community to help better understand the complex issues shaping our world today. And I want to extend a sincere gratitude to Rosalie Danbury in particular and her family, whose generous support has made this speaker series possible. Now, this year is particularly meaningful for both our country and for the Fulbright community. 2026 marks the 250th anniversary of the United States, and it also marks the 80th anniversary of the Fulbright program. For 8 decades, Fulbright has helped build bridges between our nations through education, dialogue, and shared understanding. In fact, this Thursday, hundreds of Fulbrighters from around the country and the world will come to DC to participate in our annual Advocacy Day, where we'll engage hundreds of congressmen and explain to them why the Fulbright program is the best, most cost-effective resource we have in order to spread American values around the world. At the Fulbright Association, we are also focused on strengthening our community through three strategic priorities this year. First, we're working to make the association a hub where Fulbright alumni can connect with meaningful career opportunities. Second, we're building a global marketplace of talent where the extraordinary expertise of Fulbrighters, from scientists and educators to entrepreneurs and policymakers, can be mobilized for small businesses and multinational corporations to address global issues. And third, we are committed to strengthening Fulbright as a network dedicated to community service, harnessing the spirit of international exchange to make local impact. Now, conversations like the ones that we're going to be hosting today help to carry that mission forward. And over the past year, the Fulbright Association has hosted both in-person and virtual conversations designed to help our community navigate a rapidly changing world. We've explored topics such as artificial intelligence and the future of education, mental health and leadership, the resilience of academic institutions in the face of shifting priorities in Washington, and the ongoing crisis in Venezuela, which featured former US Ambassador to Venezuela, James Story. Now, today's conversation addresses the ongoing conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran, and the broader geopolitical implications of the war for the Middle East and the international system. Many in the Fulbright community have been personally impacted by this, and they desperately want to understand the dynamics of this conflict and how it will impact them, their families, and this world. So to help guide us through this complex topic, I'm delighted to welcome Calvin Dark, who also serves with me on the board of directors of the Fulbright Association. Calvin is a communications strategist and a political commentator specializing in US and international affairs, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. He is the president of RC Communications, a strategic communications firm advising governments, NGOs, and international organizations, and he regularly provides analysis in Arabic and in English and other languages on outlets such as BBC Arabic, Al Arabiya, France 24 Arabic, and NBC Arabiya. Calvin brings a unique perspective and combines geopolitics, communication strategy, and first-hand engagement with international media audiences. So Calvin, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights with the Fulbright community.
Thank you very much, Leland. Glad to be here.
So Calvin, let's first take a step back. I know this is already week 3 of the war in Iran, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. But to set the stage for our audience, maybe some folks who haven't been following what's been going on up to this point, what are the key events that led to the United States and Israel launching these coordinated strikes against Iran? And how should we understand this conflict within the broader arc of tensions over Iran's nuclear program?
Right. I think probably just a general timeline would be I started with the negotiations that were taking place between the US and Iran over the nuclear deal. There were meetings happening and proposals or concepts of proposals being passed around but in that time, Israel and the United States did the strike 3 weeks ago. I think that the next big kind of moment when we saw that this wasn't going to be just like a weekend or a week thing was when the supreme leader was killed. That was obviously a really big moment in the conflict because it changed what I think the White House expected. I think that President Trump made it clear when the protests were there earlier this year that the United States stood by them and kind of, hint, hint, or we might help you if you want to take down the regime. Didn't happen with that timing. And I think what happened after the Supreme Leader was killed, there wasn't the reaction maybe that the White House thought. I think that the next big development for me would be when Iran started attacking regional allies. That that was a surprise. I even think the administration said that they were like, "Whoa, that's not what they were expecting." I was actually in Cyprus and Turkey just before the war started, and they got brought in there for several reasons because on one part of the island on the Greek side, Israel had a coordination. They were using that for weapons because it's not that far off from the what everything was going on. But then also you had the northern part, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, um, that was dealing with what was going on in Turkey because for a while we're thinking is Turkey going to be under a threat. So I think that was a major um, turning point. I think the next turning point would be the Strait of Hormuz because then we got to see this is something where even if the Iranian military is decimated, this is still something that they can use as a weapon against the United States and the world simply because they don't even have to do anything. All they have to do is threaten to do something, and you're going to have commercial ships that are just going to be like, we can't take that risk. So I think that would be um, I was going to say that was going to be the last big major point up until an hour ago. I don't know if you heard President Trump during the press conference. He said something that was kind of stronger than I had been expecting. He had been saying that he talked to leaders, wanted a coordinated effort, particularly in keeping the Strait of Hormuz safe. And in his press avail with for St. Patrick's Day, he said, "We don't need you." I think he literally said that. We don't need you, don't want. He said, "We don't need you, don't want you," speaking to NATO allies. And I think that kind of confirms a lot of the leaks people have been hearing that behind closed doors, a lot of our allies were just like, "Hey, we're gonna let you do your thing," because they didn't want to get into it. So I think that's kind of the how I would say the overview of events up to this point.
That's very interesting. I mean, it is quite interesting to think that, the administration didn't necessarily tell our European or NATO allies, right? And
Hmm.
then, of course, we're now expecting them to come in and bring naval ships and escort vessels and whatnot through the Strait of Hormuz, trying to basically drag them into a conflict that they had no part in it, planning in it, or anything like that.
Hmm.
Um, that's really interesting. So, President Trump has actually said um, different reasons for why there was this strike on Iran, right? I mean, first he said he wanted to
Hmm.
degrade um,
Hmm.
Iran's nuclear capabilities for good. Then it was
Hmm.
about regime change. Then it was about stopping Iran's ballistic missile program. So, from a strategic standpoint, and from your perspective, what do you believe is the U.S. and Israel? What are they trying to achieve militarily? Is it deterrence? Is it regime change? Is it destruction of Iran's nuclear program? And also, how realistic are those goals going forward?
I think that is probably the question that has been the center of my life for the last 3 weeks. Before I answer, I just want to back up. Maybe this will help give a little bit of perspective. One of the things that I just find fascinating is, as Leland said, I'm a media analyst. I'm on TV all the time, usually every day, and I focus on the Arabic channels. I do it in Arabic, so if you turn on any of the channels and you hear the North Carolina accent in Arabic, you know that it's Calvin Dark. Because I live half the time in Washington, half the time in Rabat, Morocco, I spend a lot of time in the region, but I'm a very proud American and I wear that very proudly. And so what ends up happening is I literally get questions about what's happening because when I'm on TV, because there isn't that filter of an interpreter, it's kind of like from the audiences and from the presenters, all those questions that they have for America, for the Trump administration, I kind of get those. And I find it interesting the kinds of questions that they ask. A lot of them are the same ones that we would ask. Some of them are just completely like different. And I think the one that you just talked about is probably the one the most because I want to say that the region is not a monolith. Europe's not a monolith. America's not even a monolith. So there's no like one opinion or one side. In fact, there are divisions and contradictions in positions in the region, just like you would expect to find anywhere else. However, one of the things that I have found is that a lot of times, when I come back to the States, people are like, oh my gosh, I bet they really hate us because of what we're doing. And I was like, I'm sure that there's animosity there. I'm sure there's animosity everywhere about what we're doing. From my experience, I think most people just want to know what is going on. And so the question that I've gotten the most on air and my DMs or something else questions, it's basically, what's the plan? you know? And what I found about that is there's no consensus over what should be the objective. And I think that the reason there is so much confusion is because what you just said. I could list off the reasons why I think they went. We hear a different thing from different administrations. I heard something interesting the other day when they were talking about President Trump's approach and why isn't there a concrete plan? Why didn't he lay this out before the American people? And they said because he believes plans lock him in. And that was an interesting perspective because I never thought of it like that. That once you tell somebody, here's the objective, here's how we're going to do it, you're kind of stuck with that, or else you have to admit it failed. And so I think that's part of what's going on behind the scenes. To be honest, all the things you mentioned, with probably five more, could realistically be the end goal. But I think now the end goal is ending it. I got asked 2 days ago, when will the war end? It was on a Jordanian TV channel. And I said, I think if Donald Trump had a magic wand, he would end it today because there is no more benefit politically for him. And he hasn't really expressed long-term goal other than keeping the region safe, protecting Israel from the threat of Iran and the other allies in the region. But what I was telling them, I'm like, in for a penny, in for a pound. He's now in a situation where, particularly with the Strait of Hormuz, where we can't get out easy. And so now I think the administration is trying to figure out what's the best way to exit this, because politically, we know in this midterm year, and this would go for any president, another long term engagement in the Middle East, anything involving troops on the ground, anything involving something that costs $1 billion a day that is not inside the United States is going to be a heavy thing to bear in the midterm elections. And so I think that's probably the number one question that I get from people in the region through the media.
No, absolutely. And I'm sure that more and more Americans are looking at the price of gas, right? Looking at their gas pumps and seeing it sort of increase incrementally and
Mhm.
thinking, okay, well, when is this thing going to end going forward? Um, my next question has to do with the regional escalation of this, right? I mean, you alluded to it. You said you're in Cyprus and Turkey, right?
Mhm.
And Turkey had to shoot down a missile that
Mhm.
was coming from
Mhm.
Iran,
Mhm.
which actually, when you think about it, since Turkey is a NATO ally, I mean, if that had struck, I mean, that could have potentially triggered Article 5, right? So
Right.
very, very interesting there. So we're already seeing the conflict ripple across the Middle East with Iranian retaliation targeting both Israel, US bases, regional
Mhm.
infrastructure. So, what is the risk that this war expands into a broader regional conflict involving actors like Hezbollah? I mean, we're already seeing that in Lebanon, but also Gulf states and even great powers.
I think that militarily, unless there's something that we don't know, um, there's going to be a limit to how much damage can be done in that way. Honestly, I think that this is going to be long term, but I don't think the military part is going to be the biggest part. I think the biggest part is going to be the obstruction of economic cooperation through the Strait of Hormuz and through other things. If Iran starts to target other valuable places in their countries. One of the things that I just thought was a really big development was when there was the strike near the Dubai airport, and that's a big deal because um, Dubai. I wonder I'd love to see the tourism numbers after all of this, because even if the war ends today, I noticed one of the statements that came out about it was they were like, it wasn't at the airport, it was just near. And I'm like, that doesn't give me much confidence. And thinking about that not as somebody who travels in the region, but just like we know there's a big part of Dubai's economy, and that's something that will last for years when people think about it. A similar thing happening in Doha. And so I think that we're going to see this. I don't think it's going to end anytime soon, but I think it will change from military to disturbing economic advantages, be it for tourism, be it for oil. I think we're going to see some cyber stuff, particularly with AI and disinformation, because I think what Iran has made clear is that they're not looking for an exit yet. And I think it's up to the Trump administration to kind of figure out what is that button to push where they want to actually end this in a way where we can truly stop the escalation.
That's really interesting. And I think people don't necessarily also realize how this could ripple out well beyond the Middle East, right?
Hmm.
Um, I was listening to an interesting Wall Street Journal podcast a couple days ago, linking what's going on now with Iran with the war in Ukraine, right? And why is that? Because the U.S. military, yes, we have the strongest, most advanced military in the world, but we also have limited amount of missiles, right?
Hmm.
And the same missiles that are, of course, being launched and whatnot in Iran could have been going to Ukraine in order to help it in its war against Russia. And
Hmm.
then my background, Calvin. I'm a U.S. China and Asia Pacific specialist,
Hmm.
and some of our Asia Pacific allies are concerned to say, does the United States have enough firepower, have enough weapons to support now Iran, Ukraine, and God forbid something happens in the Indo-Pacific? That's quite
Hmm.
interesting. On another sort of flip side to that, I was in Taiwan. I literally the day that the Trump administration, and Israel launched the attack, and
Hmm.
throughout the whole week, in talking to my Taiwanese interlocutors, they were actually surprised because usually the Chinese military sends fighter jets and does military exercises around Taiwan in order to scare them. But
Hmm.
throughout the whole week, there was not one Chinese fighter jet that passed through. And of course, that's because they were concerned about uh, not getting the oil from the Strait of Hormuz, right? I understand
Hmm.
that it has since resumed, right? But it just
Hmm.
kind of shows again the ripple effects of this issue, well longer or farther than we would anticipate.
Hmm.
So, as you said, you are a communications expert, um, and you have that background. Now, you've spent much of your career shaping international narratives and analyzing political messaging. How
Hmm.
are Iran, Israel, and the U.S. framing this war to their various domestic and global audiences, and which narratives are resonating internationally?
You hit on my passion, because one of the things that I love about my life and my work is that I'm obviously someone with my own political opinions, but because I advise people, I'm very good at looking at someone and evaluating their communication, whether or not I agree with it or not, and seeing if it's effective. Um, and I have seen some communications fails, and I've seen some surprising communications wins. One of the communications wins is the Iranian foreign minister appearing on at least two major cable networks. It's at a time when we didn't even have higher level US officials. And one of the things I noticed on social media, the clips from that, I had people in my life who do not even pay attention, who were sending me TikToks of the foreign ministers responding to, I think it was Meet the Press, where they were like, Donald Trump said that they're going to come to Tehran. He was like, we're waiting. And that, the way that blew up on social media, I think that was a masterclass for two reasons. One, talking to the United States people directly, and two, understanding how we work. How if he had read a white paper, nobody would have gotten that on TikTok or on Instagram. But saying that, it really encapsulated how Iran was responding. One of the things that I think is going to be really hard for this administration, and I'm not exactly sure why they did it like this. When it was first announced, we know that any operation, because of what's happening with Israel and Iran and the tension, it's going to involve Israel. That's not a surprise. I was really surprised that from the gate, it was announced that this was a joint Israeli US operation. And it's expressly stated as that. And the reason why I had an issue with it is I'm just like, you're pointing to something, one, that nobody thought we were doing this without coordination with Israel. But with a domestic constituency that's asking questions about our involvement overseas, if if we're going to do it, why are we doing it in coordination with someone else? Is it because it serves their interest or ours? And I think from a communication standpoint, it wasn't wise because you don't get anything from it. I guarantee you the coordination with Israel and participation of Israel with the United States would have been exactly the same, but it ended up decreasing some support when it was branded as a joint Israel-U.S. operation, when it didn't have to be. And I think that that's one of the things that's gonna complicate at least on the communication side, the messaging side. One other thing about the messaging that came up in one of my interviews was I if I could have a class with U.S. officials from any party, any branch, whatever, I would say be careful of the illustrative language that you use because you don't know how it sounds in another language. Okay. Um, it was so funny. I was telling one of my friends the words hell, judgment day, surgical strike, um, scumbags. I've learned how to say in Arabic because it quotes from some US officials. And we understand the strength of those in English. But I'm like, I was sitting on an interview because when you're doing an interview, you can only hear, you can't see. And I had this picture of me in my face when they were talking about something. I was like, did he say Judgment Day? Like, what's going on? And they're quoting. And so, from a communication standpoint, I understand the audience that some of the officials are trying to play to because that works with their audience. The kind of like, we're tough, we don't need anybody, all of this with the military. But what I would remind them is people are watching outside this country, and people often don't get those, and they can take it the wrong way. Um, which one more point about communications I thought was interesting, and I got asked this a few days ago. How to deal with Donald Trump's statements and tweets and like social media posts. And it was a genuine question from a producer because the producer was saying, "Hey, Calvin, is this something we need to cover? Because it sounds pretty serious." And what I explained to him is I'm like, here in the United States, I think we kind of gotten a feel for Donald Trump. We understand what he says, how to take it. That's that whole argument, take him seriously, not literally, or literally, not seriously. I guess it depends on it. But I would urge the White House to be more careful because he is the president of the United States. It's the White House. And so every word is dissected. And sometimes I see people saying things. And I'm like, well, yeah, he did say it, but Donald Trump has his own way of describing things. So, like, if you took everything he said literally, the world would be on fire. And so, from a communication standpoint, I would urge all U.S. officials to be careful because things translated, is particularly in a language as different as Arabic is from English, really hurts the message and hurts the mission, I think.
Well, let me just follow up on that point here. Are you saying, for example, specifically this word of Judgment Day? Do you think that when it was translated from English to Arabic, it adds that added sort of religious fervor to it and kind of elevates this to then an existential fight between the US and Iran. Is that how to
I th
interpret that?
I think, yeah, there's a level of maybe religiosity that I don't necessarily think the US meant, but is maybe taken from some people. But I think more so, it's it if one of the questions I get a lot for the last 3 weeks is, are negotiations still possible? If you start using things like we'll decimate them, we'll blow them up, we'll kill them all, even if that's just like rhetoric in the United States, that sends a message that, okay, well, maybe negotiations aren't possible. And so it's more like the extremeness. I think one of the things I would say, things in English that are strong, sometimes in Arabic are extreme, you know? I'll admit, like, I do media training, and I always tell my clients, when I tell you to do something, it's because I go through it. So I teach what I go through on a daily basis. And I will never forget I forgot what the situation was, but I was referring to a US official as being chaotic, okay? Which is not too strong in the United States. The producer afterwards was like, "Can you please not say that again?" Because he was like, the way you said it conjured up like the root of all evil, like the root of chaos, you know? And I was like, well, maybe that would be a better interpretation. But it's a reminder that you got to be careful with the strong language, especially when you're dealing with so many. There's a religious tone to a lot of things happening in the Middle East and increasingly here in the United States. But I think it means different things to different people, and so you just have to be careful with that.
Well, let's move on then to two more questions, and I'm going to open it up to the audience. So, for Fulbright alumni who work in diplomacy, in academia, in international development all around the world, what are the most important global implications of this conflict for them? Whether it be energy markets, shipping routes like Strait of Hormuz, and even broader geopolitical realignments.
I think from a practical standpoint, I mean, I hate that this happens, but for those who are thinking about going to certain places in the region, you're going to have to think twice. I'm not saying don't go, but like there's an added level of security to think about. I think that on the economic front, it's going to affect the lives in a lot of countries, which may affect if people are, depending on the work that they're doing. Um, I also think probably this is something that everybody would have to deal with, especially when you're a Fulbright alum. You are an ambassador to the United States. And what that means is you need to be ready. I get questions all the time because I'm on TV, but wherever you're going to be, you're going to get questions. And I encourage people to think about what are your answers, not what's your political position. I think most Fulbrighters could easily explain what their political position is, but to think about sometimes when you're out of this country and someone asks you a question like, where are the Democrats and the opposition in this? Do they agree with it or not? Remember that your answer might be the only piece of America that they get directly. Okay. And so that's what I think is good with diplomacy. And that's different from expressing your political position, which I think is you definitely should. One of the things I love about being American is let me tell you something. I was doing an interview on a channel. This was like 6 years ago, and it was a debate. And I was being critical. It was some of the United States. I was just pissed off. And the producer called me and he was like, Calvin, more than what you said, it was the fact that here you are in Washington, down the street from Congress and the White House, and you're just sitting here expressing your opinion respectfully but strongly. And you weren't thinking he was going to bust down your door and take you and put you in jail. And I was like, no. And I realized then we are all examples. He didn't care about my opinion. He was just blown over by the fact of how we as Americans operate. So I would encourage Fulbright alums to remember you're representing America, and that's a good thing because you get to tell them the things that they might not hear anywhere else.
Very, very interesting. Very powerful message as well, for sure. Um, it's funny, if I can just share a quick anecdote. Just yesterday, I was talking to one of my good friends in Beijing. And of course, the narrative that's going on in China. Right? You know that President Trump is actually supposed to be meeting with Xi Jinping in a couple of weeks' time, but apparently it's going to be postponed due to the war in Iran. But of course, the ongoing narrative in China right now is um, that the United States is warmongering right now, and that the U.S. is trying to get China to also participate and maybe bring some warships to escort commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, and of course China is going to have no part in that. But he also said something quite interesting to me, which is obviously China's history is 5,000 years old, right? And
Hmm.
you would hope that Chinese people, Chinese policymakers try to learn lessons distilled through the 5,000 years.
Hmm.
U.S. this year we're just 250 years old, right? So we're a baby in comparison.
Right, right.
And there's been example after example in our own US history. Um,
Hmm.
Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Of getting stuck in a quagmire and hoping that a conflict is going to end overnight and it ends up lasting 20 years. So
Hmm.
he says, why doesn't the US ever like really learn our lessons? I think it's a good point. Good point for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, I think just one of the points she said,
Mhm.
uh, there's an article that I read the other day. It was in one of the Arab newspapers, and it was like, "Where is China?" You know,
Mhm.
and what as I was reading it, the gist was they are not reactionary in the way that we are. And they made a comment about the timeline for China is a lot different than from other places, that they think in longer terms. So if you think about all of the things that have happened geopolitically in the last 3 weeks, not just in the region, how it's affected Ukraine, Russia, NATO. Um, I think we've forgotten that we have a former president of Venezuela sitting in New York. Like there's just a lot going on. But the article was kind of saying, don't misinterpret the silence that they're not doing anything because they have that history. They think not what's the next news cycle, but they have their own strategy for a longer term than we're thinking. I don't know. Do you think that's true?
I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, there's a Chinese saying, 一动不如一静, which is, to be calm is much better than to act, right? So I think that's exactly what we're seeing. Okay,
Hmm.
so I got one more question before opening up to the community.
Hmm.
Pathways for de-escalation and diplomacy. So, of course, the Fulbright community, we believe in dialogue and international understanding. Um, Given the current trajectory of war, what realistic diplomatic pathways exist to try to de-escalate the conflict, and what role could international actors play in this? You mentioned Dubai, UAE, Qatar. Usually, they play actually, diplomatic roles. Usually, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But now they're actually also the victims of this conflict. So, are you seeing any players, even unconventional players, trying to play the moderating role?
I am seeing that, but the thing is that Iran has made it clear that they're not interested. What I think should happen on because I agree, like diplomacy is the only way out of this for in a good way. I think that the U.S. needs to find out what it is that Iran wants now. Now, many people say, "Well, Calvin, we've known what they want." It's like, no, no, no. Lots changed in 3 weeks. You know, and it doesn't mean the U.S. has to ask them, but either through an intermediary or through one of the traditional allies that mediates, find out what it is they want. Because I think one of the problems is if we don't know what they want, we can't, not that we're going to do it, but we don't know what to work towards, you know? So, do they even want negotiations on the nuclear weapons issue? You know, are they open to something else? Would they want a detente for a period if there's no military action against them and they would like not threaten the Strait of Hormuz? I think part of diplomacy is you can't negotiate if you don't know what the other side wants, and I think that we don't really know what that is. And I think one of the quotes that just one of the things about President Trump is he's transparent. Like I think from any other president, like when he speaks his mind, I mean, like what he's thinking. He that one of the press people had said, do you think negotiations are possible? And he said, I don't know who we would negotiate with. I think that's telling because that show you I know that I'm not an expert in everything, but I can tell you this. You can't have diplomatic negotiations if you don't know who you're negotiating with. And so I think that is the key now, finding out what Iran wants. And then America with its allies can figure out, is that something realistic or is that something that's unacceptable and the war has to continue?
Very interesting. All right, we actually have quite a few questions. We got seven so far, and
Mhm.
for those in the audience, keep the questions coming. We'll try to get to all of your questions by the 2 p.m. mark. And so the first one is by Monica Lakwani. And her question is, what steps can cities take to prevent discrimination or backlash against immigrant populations during such a conflict? What are ways in which local leaders can promote social cohesion when global conflicts create local divisions? Um, which is a great question because, of course, we have 54 local chapters all across the country, right? And maybe
Mhm.
some Fulbrighters have been victims of this. So, what would you say to that?
I think that the biggest role before we as citizens do anything, we need to let our leaders know. And when I say leaders, I'm not just speaking of the White House or the secretaries, but I'm thinking about members of Congress. We have seen some statements from members of Congress that are just what? Like it, it it's when it, especially when it refers to ethnic groups and religion, they've got they have to realize that their opinion shapes how people in the districts they come from understand the people who are their neighbors. So I put that on the US officials. For citizens, I think it's just important, first of all, continue those interactions. You know what? Let me tell you something. My aunt lives in Dearborn, Michigan, and I went to go see her 2 Thanksgivings ago. And so we go to this shopping mart because I was like, what are we doing for lunch? And she said, there's this great halal place. Now, keep in mind, my aunt is 85. We go to this halal place, and she's just like chucking it up with the owners, and she's telling me about the halal, and I was like, wow. And I was like, this is what diplomacy is like. Because you know what? This woman from North Carolina and this man from Yemen, they know each other. And so I think it's those interactions at that level that help people realize there's what countries are doing, and then there's people. And so we got to make that separate.
100%, 100%. Gumbo diplomacy, right? Or food diplomacy.
Exactly. Mhm.
Okay, next question is from Maria Brewster. What are the short-term and long-term impacts on American military bases in Qatar and Bahrain in particular? Perhaps scale down, or have they been asked to leave? And actually, maybe an even broader question on like what's the current impact to U.S. civilians and military personnel that are in the region?
That is a question I had 2 days ago, and the translation of the Arabic proverb is weird. It was basically when you trust too much, you then realize you're naked. And the meaning of it was with our military bases, with these, especially particularly in the Gulf. I think people need to realize, why do we have those military bases in the first place? Why did they agree to it in the first place? Because there was this understanding that, hey, if I'm in the Gulf and I'm worried about threats coming from the region, if I have an American base there, this is protection because, yeah, the US is going to use it, but who's going to attack, us when there's like a military base here from the US? I think, unfortunately, people are now going to rethink the value of military cooperation at that level for those bases. Because let's remember, government to government, they can decide what's in their best military interest, but the governments have to make sure. I mean, they have to sell it to their people. And the argument before was it makes us safer because if the Americans are here, we're protected. That I don't think is going to go. That's not going to be the case in the future, unfortunately.
Very interesting. The next question is from Ann Kennedy, who's the president of the local National Capital Region chapter. Hey, Ann, how you doing?
Hey, and
So she says, first, she loves the linguistic overlay in this presentation. Um, and how is Iran's growing alignment with China and Russia changing regional calculations in the Middle East? Ooh, good question. Good question.
Well, I think with China, one of the things that we addressed was, their timeline and how exactly they're going to respond. I think the Russia part is so fascinating, and it doesn't get the attention it deserves because there's so much going on. We, at the same time, we're saying that we as in the White House, are coordinating, or not coordinating, but communicating with Russia and, seeing what we can do together to help, while Russia is outwardly saying they fully support Iran, and from news reports, they've been sharing intelligence or something. And I'm like, it's a baffling geopolitical thing because I, I don't, I think the questions that we see in the region are, what's the real deal? I remember it was like on the same day, Steve Witkoff was asked, what's the deal with Russia? He was like, oh, I don't believe they're sharing information. And then the next day, there's reports of them sharing information. So I think that we will find sooner or later there's a bigger link with Ukraine and Russia in this whole mix that we, I think, have underestimated. Because let's also remember, too, when you were talking about the military equipment, I think the word of the year is going to be drones. I've learned so much about drones during like the last 3 weeks. I didn't realize how cheap they were compared to, missiles. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, maybe I can get a drone because these things sound pretty cool. And it's interesting, how the drones, the Ukrainians have kind of have a lot of success with drones. Um, I think that that's going to change probably warfare for the future, but I think it's also going to change how it how warfare is happening now. Because look, the United States has the biggest, most powerful military, yeah, but if you can disrupt things militarily, not win, but disrupt things militarily at a fraction of the cost, that's going to change a lot. And I think that that is an element because of the Ukraine involvement that we're going to find out the Russia Ukraine element is a lot more to do with this than I think we're seeing now.
Absolutely, because the Iranians, they have the Shahed drones, right? Which
Hmm.
are maybe a few hundred, maybe a few $1,000s a pop to create, right?
Hmm.
And they're able to bring down whether it be large oil tankers or or ships or whatnot. And of course, our missiles are millions upon millions of dollars each one, right?
Hmm.
So there's
Hmm.
definitely the asymmetric warfare on that end. Not to even mention the undersea drones and mines that the Iranians can continue to put into the Strait of Hormuz, right?
Right, exactly.
Um, from the Russian standpoint, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, the Trump administration has, I think, relieved or canceled sanctions, right? Oil sanctions on the Russians.
Hmm.
So they're essentially being sort of one interpretation is that they're essentially being rewarded for having provided intelligence to the Iranians to target, um, U.S. military
Hmm.
bases in areas like that. And
Hmm.
then on the China front, I don't know. I think it kind of cuts both ways. I think you'll like this. I think from a narrative perspective, this is a gift to China on a global stage because China, for certainly since the Trump administration has come back, China's been trying to create a contrast between itself and the US, saying, now we are the mantles of the international community, right? We are the
Hmm.
standard bearers of the international system. It's the US is trying to tear it down. Whether this is true or not, right? That's
Hmm.
a whole debate, right? But this
Hmm.
is the narrative that the Chinese are trying to say. And so the U.S. and Israel prosecuting these strikes against Iran,
Hmm.
further adds to that narrative that China is trying to do. That's on one end. On the other end, China continues to say we're in solidarity with our partners. They said the same thing with Venezuela, right? But
Hmm.
they actually don't have the military capacity to actually back it up, right? So
Right.
in some ways, this kind of shows that the emperor has no clothes to a certain extent. So it'll be interesting to sort of see what happens going forward.
And on that note, one of the
Yeah.
things that I fear on the long term, because I really believe in the strength of international institutions, international law, is between Venezuela and now Iran, we've set a precedent that you can go to war without consensus, without going to the UN, without um, not without cause, but without like a reason that everybody kind of agrees with. You know what I mean? That was kind of like the understanding before. I mean, we've gone to war a lot of times when the world didn't like it, but I think most Americans understood why, even if they didn't think we should go to war. And that's going to be unfortunate because how are we as Americans going to tell the next country that goes and invades a country and takes out a leader, well, you didn't get, you need to share that with the world because we didn't do it. So I'm worried about that setting a precedent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, the next question is from Judith Monachina. Where would you suggest we get the most accurate reporting and commentary about this war? Should we be watching and listening to multiple language sources?
Yes, I think multiple language sources. Um, like, obviously every channel has its bias, so that's why I tell people whether it's international or domestic, mix it up, and instead of listening from one perspective from a channel, compare them. One of the things that I like is op-eds. It's a really good way of understanding the news because if you take, say you read an op-ed from a liberal publication and then from a more conservative publication or whatever, you get more of the full story because each one of those op-eds is making the argument, right? And so I believe that's a good way to get the news because you get to see the arguments people are making and you know where they're coming from. If you go to a conservative outlet and they have an op-ed about Iran, read it because you already know where they're coming from. So you hear that argument. And then look at one from a liberal source. So I think diversify your sources and pay attention to op-eds.
Do you have, just a quick follow-on, do you have a go-to source? Or rather, are there any um, unconventional sources of news that maybe we might not think of, beyond the Al Jazeeras and the, Al Arabiya?
Um, Not any unconventional sources, but I think the best thing is um, I kind of divide my news consumption up into two groups. There's the group of I just need to know what happened, you know, and that's usually AP, Reuters, BBC. They're giving the alerts. I think that's important. Then there's the let's tell you what that means. And that's getting a little more into, what bias they're coming from. I have my like basket. Um, it's a highly kept secret to what's in my basket, but I will tell you, make your basket. I don't mean like a lot of sources. Have like three or four in the basket of they're telling me what this means, and have one or two like Reuters, AP that just let you know, hey, this happened. And I think that's a good mix. But as you said, one of the things I've learned is the big publications, a lot of times they have good reporting just because they have the resources, but don't sleep on these small publications with credibility, even online, because a lot of times they point out the things that other bigger publications are afraid to.
Well, following on this line, because the another question just came in from Jonathan Goodman Levitt, which is again along the lines of news. Um, Given your expertise, can you please comment on the political leanings and perspectives of media originating from the Middle East? So particularly the leanings of Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and how have they changed over the last few years?
Um, not just every country, but every channel has their own political leanings, their own priorities. One of the things that I will say that I'm proud of. Do you know that in the 3 years or 2.5 years since I've been doing interviews in Arabic, I've only had one time where they kind of asked me to avoid a particular topic you know and so that's what I tell people. There's this impression like in the Arab world that they're oppressive with the media. I'm like, no. They never tell me what I can say. I did one time when they're talking with Jeffrey Epstein. They're like, Calvin, please don't describe what happened in Arabic, even though like because it's just a cultural thing. They're like, we just don't want to do that. But it's very free. I think instead of political leanings, it's more of what are the country's priorities. Um, like you remember when Donald Trump went to the Middle East, his first trip last year? It wasn't that there was a particular political leaning from some of the channels, but some of the channels were just like, we're just going to call this straight down the middle. We're literally going to just show what he did, who he met with. We don't want commentary for or against. And I think that came from a we don't want to make trouble when we don't have to, you know? Now, I think that a factor in a lot of the Middle Eastern publications is the government plays a huge role. Um, and so I think if you're looking at political leanings, think about what the government has to win or lose from critiquing, say, the United States. But I think in general, you find a lot of sources, they're very bold sources, particularly online.
Um, there's a question here by um, Jehan Jack, which has to do about your views on the duration and intensity of this conflict and the potential involvement of regional proxies like the Houthis.
I heard yesterday, I think I got this right. There's this expert, he had said the war, it will either last like 1 week, 1 month, or several months. Like once you pass the 1 month mark, then you're in it for a while. I think that the war might not last. It seems like the active fighting, but the after effects will continue. But the thing is that I don't if we don't know what the goal is, it's hard to tell like when we're going to stop. One of the most interesting things from a communication standpoint related to that question is you notice how when President Trump talks about when he gets that question, like how long it's going to last, he's like, I could end it today, could end it tomorrow. I think in the beginning that was probably right. I think now it shows you just how big this conflict is because he can't by himself. And that just goes to show you that there's a lot of things at play. And so the duration, I think, is going to be long term. I don't think the military part is, but the economic part probably will be.
I used to work for the Department of Defense, and the military likes to say that no matter what plan that you have or strategy that you have, the enemy always gets a vote, right?
Right.
Um,
What was that Mike Tyson said? Everybody has a plan until you get
yeah,
punched in the
punch in the face,
face.
exactly, exactly.
Yes.
All right, so I know that we've got about 6 minutes left. I'm gonna bundle these two questions and comments together. The first one is from Bob Gervasi, and Calvin, if you haven't heard that name before, he was previously the chair of the Fulbright Association. So, Bob, it's great to see you. Thanks for your question. His question is about Pope Leo. Um, could Pope Leo play a diplomatic role as his priorities, his commitment to peace as well as interreligious dialogue? That's from Bob. And then from Susana Fuertes, she was a Fulbright Research Scholar to the Kingdom of Bahrain, 2023 to 2025. And so, in your opinion, Calvin, what ways might the ongoing tensions and conflict involving the US, Israel, and Iran influence the strategic decision-making of the GCC countries, and including their participation in the Board of Peace?
Yes, I think on the Pope question, yes, he can definitely have a role. One of the things I mentioned to one of my friends a few months ago is I'm like, why doesn't he play up the fact that he's from Chicago? Like I grew up Baptist, so I'm looking at this from the outside. But I realized, and my friend was like, because he's the Pope first. Like, I know we want him wearing like Chicago paraphernalia. I think, and I don't know if this is possible or even advisable, if we could see that American side here it could have, I mean, look, he's the Pope. I think it'll have just as much effect as any other Pope. But I do think it's interesting that he's American, and I think he has an interesting perspective. So I hope with that. For the GCC, I think what's going to happen with the GCC, what's going to happen with the EU, is they're going to realize, look, I don't think there's ever going to be a hope anytime in the near or far future where they're not going to cooperate with the United States. I think the ties, be it political, cultural, military, are too strong for even for one event like this to change it. I do think that they're coming up with their backup plans. And that, of course, is unfortunate. And I think with the GCC in particular, they're going to be thinking about, okay, how do we diversify things so that we have more of a say in case we end up not having the support from America that we need? Or on the basis question in some of those countries in the region, if they're like, I don't think they're going to get rid of the bases unless something really bad happens. But I do think they're going to think like, okay, maybe our defense can't just be based in the fact that there are American soldiers here. Maybe we need to think about how do we basically manage to get more on our own 2 feet in ways that they didn't think about before. So I think that's one of the things going to think about.
Man, this is great. Calvin, thank you so, so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. This was
I've
such an
enjoyed it.
enriching discussion. And to the audience, thank you for taking the time to join us for today's Fulbright Lens speaker series. I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you again to Rosalie Danbury and her family for the generous contributions for making this speaker series possible. And every Fulbrighter is an expert, right? So if you
Mhm.
would like to speak at a future Fulbright Lens series, if you have a topic that you want to share, if you want to nominate somebody within our Fulbright community to be a speaker, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And can't wait to see you for the next one. And for those who are going to be participating in the upcoming Fulbright Advocacy Day on Thursday in DC, looking forward to seeing you all in person so that we can advocate for the best program that builds bridges and peace throughout the world at the most important time right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great week.